Tony Abbot. Thank you for being here with us in the studio. This is also my office, and it's great to have you. And we've been to Port Lincoln and back talking to people about The Voice, which I want to get into. But thanks for being here. And thanks for coming in.
Alex, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, and congratulations on the good work you've been doing in the Senate.
Oh, thank you for that. It's an interesting environment, that building. You've got lots of stories. I want to cover off on some of them today, but I'm interested in your views, broadly about the state of politics in this country and globally at the moment. What's your view on the state of politics generally, the type of discourse we're having and where it's heading?
Well, I've been watching politics pretty closely for the best part of 40 years now. And I reckon that here in Australia we had a bit of a golden age from the beginning of the Hawke government through until the end of the Howard government. I think that Hawke was probably, definitely the best peacetime Labor Prime Minister, probably the best Labor Prime Minister ever. The Hawke government had some very big figures in it. And then I think there's no doubt that the Howard government was a really outstanding government. Again, big figures in it. So we had 25 pretty good years as a country. And under Hawke and then under Howard, we significantly reformed and improved our economy. We managed to substantially increase our population while at the same time maintaining and I think probably increasing social cohesion. So they were good years. I think the years since have been disappointing. I think the quality of our public life has deteriorated. And certainly if you look at the quality of the people on the front benches of both sides of Parliament and compare it with the quality of the front benches in the Hawke and Howard times, I think you'd have to say that there hasn't been an improvement. In fact, the opposite is the case.
So what's caused that?
I think there are a lot of factors. I think that as a calling, public life is not as respected as it once was. I think part of the problem is that social media has made public life harder. The 24/7 news cycle has made public life harder. I think that the political discourse has become more fragmented and polarised, again in part the result of social media and the fact that people are not getting their information from newspapers and television stations. They're now getting it increasingly from a curated social media feed, which can often mean that people live in self-reinforcing echo chambers on both sides of the fence. I think this has all contributed. The fact that so many people in Parliament today on both sides are basically from an apparatchik class. Too many of them have spent almost all of their lives inside a political bubble. I don't think any of this helps. But look, what we should be doing is not lamenting the world, but try to improve it. One of the reasons why I still try to be as active as I can be in public life, admittedly from a somewhat more remote vantage point than once, is because I still want to make a difference. I still feel very deeply that we should be there to make things better as far as we can. And Alex, you certainly have been very forthright in speaking out. You haven't let the desire for promotion, preferment, get in the way of speaking your mind. And frankly, from all points of view, we need people to be prepared to speak their mind. And yes, we should try to be polite, we should try to be respectful, but in the end, we will only advance if people are prepared to speak the truth as they see it. And we look at each one's perceptions about the truth, and that way our understanding advances and we go forward.
And you're right about being involved in politics. One of the things I think you've done very well post-politics is stay involved, and you're so busy. You know, you're here today for a range of other engagements, and it's a busy schedule. You're an active person. But, I mean, what does life look like for the very exclusive club of an ex-Prime Minister? I mean, give us a snapshot into the day or week.
Well, it obviously looks different for different ex-Prime Ministers. I mean, you know, I look at Julia Gillard, for instance. She seems to spend most of her time overseas. She's got a couple of big jobs with quite significant organisations. I think Malcolm Turnbull is probably mostly managing his business interests. Scott Morrison is obviously still in the Parliament. John Howard is continuing to play an active role in our public life. And I suppose I would probably regard Howard as my role model amongst the ex-Prime Ministers. My day, it comprises talking quite a bit to some of my current and former colleagues, quite a bit of writing and speaking, particularly for the Institute of Public Affairs, where I'm a senior fellow. I still write a bit for the newspapers and occasionally have speeches to make overseas. And apart from that, I'm on the War Memorial Council. I'm on the board of the Centre for the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation. I have a role with the UK government's Board of Trade. I help the Morrison government on the trade deal with India. I'm a deputy captain in the local rural fire brigade. So while I certainly don't have any particular full-time job, Alex, I look back on each day and think, my God, that was busy.
It's a busy
Even
schedule.
if it's sometimes hard to precisely put your finger on what you've done.
Active, that's the key, isn't it? And what about, so we talked about a little bit about politics, and you've obviously, as you say, you've been watching it for a long period of time. To me, and this is just my perception, it feels like in the last 5 to 10 years, things have really slipped in terms of the push from the left. We seem to be now talking about things that I never thought we'd talk about in politics. You know, some of the gender stuff, some of the things that kids are being taught in schools. But there is a theory that the long march through the institutions is kind of well and truly almost at the end of its tether. How do you see that? Is it my imagination, or are institutions really reeling from some of this ideology?
Well, there are lots of things today, Alex, which I don't believe would have been credited a decade or so back. I mean, I sometimes talk about peak stupidity, and when I'm casting around for illustrations of peak stupidity, I think of the climate cult, I think of the recent virus hysteria, I think of the gender fluidity push, I think of the magic pudding economics, and in particular, I think of the cultural self-loathing which today afflicts countries like Australia, which is so unjustified, and yet it is so prevalent. I was sitting next to a very young person the other day at an event, and she was talking about her schooling, and she said, look, she very much got the message from her quite good private school education that Australia was a fundamentally illegitimate society, given that we were founded by the dispossession of the Indigenous people, and we've proceeded on in a racist, sexist, homophobic, etc. way. Now, I wouldn't say that everything about our past or our present is perfect, but I would say that our country has never been less racist, and I would say that the story of Australia is one of constant progress towards a better future. And the fact that hundreds of thousands of people are desperate at any one time to become Australians, most of them people from non-English speaking backgrounds, suggests to me that this is a very attractive place to live, and that people think we're pretty damned good. I just wish we could see more of that ourselves.
Yeah, I agree with you on that 100%. And it is a phenomenon that's across the West, though, isn't it? We see the same phenomenon, this kind of culture of demonising a supposed colonialised past. What do you put it down to? Is it a cultural trend, or is it a broader push, or is it the Long March?
Well, you're right, Alex, that the Long March of the left through the institutions has contributed. But I think there are more basic factors at play. I think that our own innate decency has in some ways got the better of us. We have been too polite to push back against people who are speaking what we know to be folly, but because we maybe feel a bit guilty about things in the past, maybe feel that we don't want to be too aggressive or upsetting to people, we acquiesce in things which, frankly, we shouldn't have acquiesced in. Now, I absolutely accept that we have to be respectful to minorities. We have to be respectful to divergent viewpoints. We've got to appreciate that everyone comes at things from their own perspective, and they're all human beings that we have to treat fairly and decently. But we also have to engage in the contest of ideas, because if we abdicate from the contest of ideas, well, bad ideas will flourish. And I think that's the difficulty that we've got at the moment. A lot of arrant nonsense is out there because we show too much latitude.
But it is a double down effect, isn't it? Because people, I think you're quite right when you say don't want to be involved in a pitched battle that they could be when they just want to have a dinner party or they're sitting around at the pub and they want to talk about issues. But is part of the problem, or isn't part of the problem, the fact that they're not getting the facts as well? I mean, to say that Australia is a systemically racist country is on any measure completely wrong. And yet there would be people out there that don't have the confidence to argue that case back, perhaps because they're not fed the information. Now, is that a product of conservative politics not being strong enough? Is that a product of the media not pushing a different narrative, or a combination of all of the above?
Look, a lot of it is just ignorance, frankly, sheer ignorance. For instance, how anyone could somehow accuse Britain, of all countries, of being the author of slavery, when in fact it was the Royal Navy which stamped out the transatlantic slave trade. Britain was at the forefront of stamping out slavery, and yet we have academics in Britain routinely excoriating contemporary Britain for these supposed sins. And yet, if there is any country that should be entitled to hold its head up high and be proud of its past, it's the United Kingdom.
Well, it takes me to another limb of that, which is the thing you were here, or yesterday you were here to talk to people over on the West Coast about the voice to Parliament, as it has been called. And it's easy to complicate the issue, but to my mind, it's a very simple issue of we don't divide on race. How do you see it? And how do you see that message rolling out? Do you think this is going to be fought on the battlefield of detail, or is it just a simple matter of we are all Australians?
Well, I think it is a simple matter of we're all Australians. I mean, there's a lot of detail which we haven't been told, and there are a lot of, I think, difficult conclusions that we can draw from that which we have so far been told. But in the end, it's really a simple question. Do we want our country to be divided into those whose ancestry extends back past 1788 and everyone else? And I don't think there should be two classes of Australian. I think we're all Australians together. We should all have exactly the same rights, exactly the same responsibilities, and exactly the same say over how our government operates. Now, given that we already have, thanks to the operation of our democracy, 11 individual Indigenous voices in the Parliament, this argument that we need over and above that a special and separate Indigenous voice that only Indigenous people can choose and only Indigenous people can be members of, I just think it's wrong in principle, as well as being unnecessary divisive and potentially dangerous in practice.
And I mean, I think I agree with you. I think the divisive nature of it is enough to kill it off, in my mind. But of course, there are nuances to all of this. And you've said, I think, in the Australian recently that legal experts are those that are speaking about it are talking about there being a range of constitutional issues that arise from this. Are they the sorts of things that we're going to be able to convey in a short message? I mean, Australians are getting back to the issue of what they're being fed and the information they've got to push back on it. They're not yet getting the information about what this really means. The problems are real.
Absolutely, they are. And anyone who wants to be better informed should actually look at some of the submissions to the recent parliamentary inquiry into the Voice. And there were distinguished jurist after distinguished jurist who were submitting that this is far more complex, far more difficult than the Prime Minister is pretending. And I think it's absolutely certain that should we have this voice, we're going to be tied up in litigation in the High Court for years. Two very distinguished academic constitutional lawyers, Professors Nick Aroney and Peter Gerangelos, one from the University of Sydney, one from the University of Queensland, they jointly submitted that this voice is effectively going to be a fourth arm of government. Now, we talk about the legislative, executive and judicial arms of government. Well, they're saying because this is going to have its own separate section of the Constitution, it's effectively a fourth arm of government. The other arms of government are going to have to take this very seriously. And I reckon that if this voice happens, nothing significant will be able to be done without Indigenous consent, which effectively means that the voice will have a veto over what our government does. Now, I certainly think that Indigenous people need to be taken seriously, and I certainly think that where government is doing something that specifically relates to Indigenous people, of course, there has to be consultation. But at the end of the day, why should 4% of the population have a virtual veto over decisions for 100% of the population? That's just not right.
And of course, one of the things people probably don't know about you is the amount of work you've done on a sort of volunteer basis with Indigenous communities. Also, you've spent a lot of time up there in your various roles in politics. But you would be as well placed as anyone in the public sphere to know what's going to work for Indigenous communities and what isn't. And there's this perception that the voice is somehow going to change lives, particularly in remote communities. What's your view on that?
Well, this idea that having 24 Indigenous people meet in Canberra is somehow going to improve policy responses in Alice Springs, etc., is just wrong. It's just wrong. The problem in remote Indigenous Australia, and that's where the problems are, much less so in the cities and major towns. The problems for Indigenous people are very much more acute in remote Australia than anywhere else. And the difficulty in all of these remote places, as anyone who's been there knows, is that the kids don't go to school, the adults don't go to work, and the ordinary law of the land only sporadically applies. Now, we don't need an expert body to sort this out. What we need is the will to expect of Indigenous people the same things that we expect of every other Australian, namely that your child does go to school, that you do go to work, that the law is obeyed, and that the police are there to make sure that happens and to keep people safe. Now, we don't need a new body in Canberra to tell us that. What we need at every level of government, throughout officialdom and indeed throughout society, is the strong expectation that the same standards apply to all. And you don't get a leave pass. You don't get a leave pass from school, work, or obeying the law because you happen to be living in Yuendamu or Amateur or somewhere like that. One law for all. one parliament for all. That's what we need going forward.
And I mean, there is more to it as well, isn't there? I mean, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, when people actually read it, talks in different language than we're hearing about the Voice already, and it talks about sovereignty and what we've seen in Queensland over the last week or so with this treaty being pushed. Do you see this being a precursor to reparations treaty obligations and potentially even a sovereign nation or nations for Aboriginal people in this country?
There's absolutely no doubt that the Indigenous activists are trying to unwind 2 centuries of the sovereignty of the Crown and try to re-inject what they see as the lost sovereignty of so-called First Nations. Now, this is not a term that I use because the idea that the Indigenous clans and tribes that held sway over this country pre-1788 was somehow nations in the same way that Britain and France might be is just wrong. It's just wrong. But that's what the activists want. They essentially want to ensure that nothing can be done without Indigenous say-so. Nothing significant can be done without Indigenous say-so. And once we've got this voice in place, we'll then have a so-called truth-telling, which is rewriting our history from an Indigenous perspective, or rather with a sort of a grievance angle, and there'll be treaties. Now, inevitably, given the view that the so-called First Nations never really ceded sovereignty in order to, as it were, justify the sovereignty of the Crown, there will have to be reparations, compensation, etc. A lot of money is going to inevitably change hands. Now, whether that's because taxpayers make a big settlement on different Indigenous bodies, whether that's because citizens are expected to pay fees to Indigenous bodies if they want to do something with their land, is yet to be worked out. What we're on, should we go down this voice path, is a journey into the unknown. We can be absolutely certain that what's coming to us is a lot more complexity and a lot more cost if we do go down this path.
And this is not being explained to Australians
Not
yet.
at all, because the Prime Minister and the activists behind this know that if it's fully explained, it won't be accepted. That's why the Prime Minister is at pains to assure us that really this is no big deal. It's just a question of being polite and respectful for Aboriginal people. But if you do go to the activists who have helped to shape this, people like Marsha Langton, some of the other people behind it, Megan Davis, they will tell you things that you can't shut this voice up. Of course the High Court is going to be adjudicating on these matters, because what they want is a situation where nothing of substance can be done without an Indigenous say-so, because that's the way they think Australia should be. There should be a form of Indigenous sovereignty over this country, and as I said, I just don't think it's right that 4% of the population, 200 odd years after the first fleet arrived and modern Australia began, I just don't think it's right that 4% of the population should have a special say over what happens to all of us.
And it's going to be a big push. We've seen that already. The last couple of days, sporting codes have jumped on board to push it. We're seeing big business doing that. There are a lot of parallels, I think, with the Brexit period, where it was a similar sort of dynamic, and the experience was there that the message got out in different ways. How are we going to get these messages out to people, so that they can understand what we're really dealing with? How's it won?
Well, look, it's going to be won vote by vote, person by person, conversation by conversation, argument by argument, discussion by discussion. And I think we have to accept that anything that involves changing the Constitution is important. I think we have to try to inform ourselves about it. And then I think we need to be prepared to have discussions with our family members, our friends, our neighbours, our workmates, the people we play sport with, the people we socialise with. And there will be disagreements, no doubt about that. And let's hope we can keep the disagreements polite. Let's hope that we don't split families and sunder friendships as a result. But one of the things I worry about is that because there has been almost a weaponisation of this issue by the government since the election, a total failure to seek bipartisanship since the election, because there is this strong overtone of moral intimidation, this implication, if not outright statement, from the Voice supporters that if you don't agree, you are disrespectful, if not actually racist. I fear that this is going to be a difficult conversation, and frankly, it's been well known and well accepted until recently that the precondition for a successful change is bipartisanship. The precondition of a successful change of this nature is a measure of consensus. I just think it's deeply regrettable that in the absence of bipartisanship and in the absence of a measure of consensus, the Prime Minister is continuing to push on. I wish he would pull this thing, because I think one way or another it's going to end in tears. But if he insists on pushing forward with it, it must be defeated.
Couldn't agree more. You mentioned splitting families and division, and probably good time to shift gears into COVID, because we saw a lot of that during the COVID period. 2.5, 3 years, we've come out the other end of it, but obviously there was a lot of, I think, a lot of navel gazing and review that has to go on from that. What's your view on the approach taken? I know there were different approaches, but from a federal level, how did it play out? How did it play out that we were locking down businesses, and I know that was a state issue, but allowing these sorts of things to happen in Australia in 2020? Were you troubled by the COVID period in that manner?
When I was the health minister in the Howard government, I did a lot of thinking about potential pandemics. Back in the day, we were worried about a bird flu pandemic because we did have several hundreds of cases of bird flu in China and other parts of East Asia. And that was a very, very deadly disease, something like a 30% case fatality rate. And we feared that any pandemic version, at least initially, would have a very, very high mortality rate, perhaps exceeding the mortality rate of the Spanish flu pandemic back in the 1918, 1919. And in the United States, which then had a population of about 100 million, it's thought that 500,000 people perished as a result of that pandemic. So we all did a lot of thinking back then, and the result of that thinking was a national pandemic plan here in Australia, and there were similar pandemic plans in all of the other major countries. Those plans essentially provided for a strict quarantine on the borders for a period of time during which we would ramp up our hospital system to cope and do our best to protect the elderly. But there was never any thought of ordering people to stay at home, ordering business to close. In fact, we thought that the big challenge would be keeping essential services going, given levels of disease and given the fear that people might have of going abroad under such circumstances. Interestingly, all of the pandemic plans, including our own, were essentially junked in the first weeks of March 2020 in favour of the Wuhan plan. And the Wuhan plan was basically lock everyone up and hope that this virus disappears. Well, once you've got a virus, it's not going to disappear. We've got to learn to live with it, as the pandemic plans accepted. But no, in our better understanding, supposedly better understanding, we went with the Wuhan plan and thought that we could eliminate the virus. Well, we spent the best part of 2 years trying to do that. We inflicted massive damage on ourselves. Yes, we probably did minimise deaths early on by doing this. But in the end, we were always going to have to cope with this. And I certainly think that the first lockdown may have been justifiable, but the subsequent lockdowns certainly weren't.
So how did we get to a point where the Wuhan plan was junked? What in your view made this country turn its back on a pre-prepared plan of attack?
Well, I think it was fear and apprehension that was fueled by the footage coming out of northern Italy in late February, early March 2020 of hospitals apparently being overwhelmed by COVID patients. Now, it was a serious situation, and you do have to ensure that your hospital system can cope, which is why, under the plans that we had in place, we would implement strict quarantine for a period on our borders to delay the advent of the pandemic disease in this country, and in the meantime ramp up our hospital system, in part by designating some hospitals as pandemic hospitals, emptying them of their normal caseload, and having them ready to deal with the pandemic illness, and as far as we could, creating extra facilities to deal with that. You might remember back in March, April of 2020, the Victorian Premier, Daniel Andrews, announced that the Victorian government was going to create 4,000 extra ICU beds in Victoria, and in particular was going to turn the exhibition centre in Melbourne into a pandemic ICU centre. The Victorian government, in the end, despite spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, supposedly, to create these additional ICU beds, didn't create any additional ICU beds. And that was why they had to keep the state locked down for very, very long periods of time, because they didn't ramp up the health system to deal with additional cases, which you might have early on in any pandemic situation. So look, we took our lead from what was going on in Wuhan. We locked everyone up. Then the idea grew that we could somehow eliminate this virus. We couldn't. And in the meantime, we neglected, particularly in New South Wales, in Victoria rather, particularly in Victoria, we neglected taking the steps that the pandemic plans mandated.
Are we becoming too
risk averse?
Risk averse and directed by global bodies like the World Health Organization? Are we listening too much to them and the UN and other bodies?
Well, in the end, we have to have elected and accountable ministers and heads of government making the appropriate decisions, and sensible ministers and sensible governments certainly take advice from the relevant experts. But in the end, it's the government that has to make the decision. And if the business of government is just following expert advice, why bother with elections? Why bother with parliaments? We'd just do what the officials tell us to do. It would be an official dictatorship, so to speak, as opposed to a liberal democratic regime. And as we now know, we weren't really following official advice, because the official advice varied from month to month and from state to state. And what we were really doing was, I think, being ultra cautious, almost chronically risk averse, when it was pretty clear from April of 2020 on that while this was serious, it certainly wasn't the Black Death. It wasn't even the Spanish flu. And yet we treated it as though it were. And as a result, we spent hundreds of billions of dollars that we shouldn't have spent. And we spent months and months, even years, locked down in ways that were not necessary.
And we spent large periods of time allowing people to be removed from their jobs because they were refusing mandatory vaccination. Some of that was public. Of course, the state governments had a lot to do with that, but also at federal level, we had companies, under the Corporations Act being in that position and effectively sacking people. What's your view on that, and from an individual liberty point of view?
Well, I was very happy to get vaccinated because I didn't want to see a situation where certain risk-averse experts could justify keeping us locked up for any longer than was absolutely unavoidable. So I was happy to get vaccinated, and I certainly encouraged others to get vaccinated. But I think that it's a big jump from encouraging people to get vaccinated and insisting upon people getting vaccinated. And I think one of the saddest aspects of the whole period was seeing hundreds of thousands of people excluded from their jobs because for whatever reason they chose not to be vaccinated. Now, I might have disagreed with them, but their body, their choice.
As we have heard in other debates many times. On the issue of public policy and contentious issues, the issue of education, one of the things people say to me all the time, particularly mothers, is how worried they are about the state of the education system. Now, once again, similar to the previous discussion, a lot of that is in the hands of the states, but it is fair that the federal government provides funding, so it has some levers to pull when it comes to controlling education and national. What's your view of the trajectory of education in this country, the sorts of things kids are being taught? Do you see a drop-off in standards?
To the extent that we have objective indicators, they certainly do indicate a drop-off in standards. If you go back a couple of decades, Australia was in the top 10 or 20 countries when it comes to the standardised academic tests for maths, for science, for reading and so on. We've been plummeting over the last couple of decades. On some of these indicators, we're now behind places like Kazakhstan. And given the amount of money that we've spent, it's tragic, frankly. We really are storing up trouble for the future by allowing this to happen. Now, I think it's pretty clear what we need in our schools. We need more rigorous academic curriculum. We need more parental involvement. We need better quality teachers, and we need more principal autonomy. And I think those four principles should guide any of the people who are running educational systems. Now, you're right, Alex. Part of the problem here is the dog's breakfast of divided responsibilities between the Commonwealth and the states. It is the states that run public schools. It is the states in the end that set curricula, etc. But because the Commonwealth is now on the hook for substantial percentage of the funding for state schools, the states have now got an excuse every time something goes wrong to say, well, it's all the fault of the Commonwealth because they're not giving us enough money. And so you've got a situation increasingly in education, as too often in health as well, where things are not going as well as they should, but it's very hard to tell who's in charge. And one of the things that I was hoping to do through the tax reform and federation-wide Federation Reform white paper processes that I put in place as Prime Minister was to try to some extent unscramble that egg, to try to make it clear that one level of government was in charge of particular services, particular institutions, so that when things weren't going right, you knew exactly who to blame. And when things weren't going right, there was one level of government that actually had it within its power and authority to fix it. Now, unfortunately, those white paper processes were terminated by my successor, and the dysfunctional mess, which is our federation, continues to this day.
The national curriculum was meant to address some of these problems, wasn't it, happening? And arguably, it's potentially even made it worse now. One of the things that consistent complaints is from parents that I get is that they are worried about the books that are in school libraries. They're worried about the indoctrination of kids into a certain worldview, a leftist worldview. That's, as you say, I think that term unscrambling the egg is pretty right. It's pretty hard to unpick now, isn't it?
We've got to give it a go. And if it were up to me, there would be no federal funding for state schools. There would be no federal funding for public hospitals. These would be wholly responsibilities of the states. The Commonwealth would perhaps take over full responsibility for preschools and childcare. Commonwealth would take over full responsibility perhaps for aged care. Possibly the Commonwealth could take over full responsibility for technical education, as it has for university education, etc. So I do think there needs to be this clarification of roles, because at the moment, if you wanted to change the national curriculum, for instance, you'd need to get the consent of all of the state, territory and federal education ministers. That's almost never going to happen, which means the bureaucrats are in charge, which means that the drift to the left will just continue, and more of our education, particularly in the social science area, will become politically correct brainwashing. I
mean, this is the frustration, isn't it? People have got that I hear it all the time. People now are frustrated by the size of government, the amount of control bureaucracy's got. We saw that during COVID, and in fact, politics gave and gifted a whole heap of powers to the bureaucracy. Once the bureaucrats have got control of the levers, it's really hard. But there must be a way we can get back to doing the sorts of things you did in your first year with, repealing sort of all of the regulation that we could. And I mean, that's obviously a long journey. Is it achievable?
Look, it is achievable, but it is going to be a long countermarch, if you like, through the institutions. And if I may say so, Alex, one of the reasons why the Howard government was so successful was because an enormous amount of policy thinking was done in the opposition years. And that in turn was building on a lot of policy thinking that had been done in the wider community. The fight back policy, which John Hewson took to the 1993 election, probably went a little bit too far in a few areas, but it was at the least the product of very sustained policy thinking across the whole sweep of portfolio areas. I mean, basically what Fightback was an attempt to ask, what is government currently doing badly that should be doing better? What is government doing that it shouldn't be doing at all? And what might government do, which it currently isn't doing? So it was a very comprehensive, holistic look at how government could do things better and help more without suffocating society, without subjecting the citizen to the straitjacket of government. It was, I think, really a wonderful achievement, and John Hewson's lasting legacy to our polity. I think we need to go through a similar process We need to look at every portfolio area from first principles and to say, what are we doing? What good is it really achieving? How can we do it better? And where are the areas where maybe we shouldn't be doing anything at all and leaving it entirely to the good sense and the judgment of private citizens?
I think we're running out of time here because we've got another engagement, but a couple of things on that. Are we over-governed? Do we have too many layers of government in this country? Federal, state, local?
I think if we were starting from scratch, we would probably have 2 layers of government rather than 3. But we can't undo the past. We are a federation, for better or for worse. We will stay a federation. The idea that we could abolish the states is just not realistic. And ideally, the states could work better than they do. So I think the challenge is to rebuild the federation where each level of government is truly sovereign in its own sphere. And as I said, that was what processes that I began as Prime Minister were designed to move towards. And I still think it's important to have another look at that.
In the time we've got left, energy. I mean, we could take an hour and a half doing this one, but energy policy, we bills are going up.
Yeah.
Coal and gas projects being completely, pulled, in the energy production from coal and gas being on the chopping block. Is there a future for nuclear energy in this country?
There should be. And one of the first things that the next coalition government should do, if it's not done beforehand by the current government, is remove the ban on civil nuclear energy. I mean, this idea that we can have nuclear power at sea in our next generation of submarines, and it'll be okay for the submarines and their nuclear reactors to tie up at a wharf, but you couldn't have the same kind of a reactor somewhere on land is just ludicrous. It's ludicrous. It's completely illogical. So I think that this must change. And I also think that if we are going to get to net zero, and we can argue the toss about whether that was a wise commitment for the former government to make, but if we are going to get to net zero and keep the lights on and keep making things in this country, nuclear has got to be a large part of that path.
Couldn't agree more. We probably do have to wind it up now. This is straight out of left field, but what's something about Tony Abbot that people don't know? What's something that that you do that you're proud of that people don't know that you're willing to share on this? Well, I've lived in a goldfish bowl for most of the last 30 years. It's pretty hard to not be transparent.
And I'm not sure that there's anything more I'd like people to know.
Could be enough. Enough.
I think they're probably, when I was emerging from the surf in my budgie smugglers, people already thought, we've seen enough. Yeah. We've seen enough. No more.
Yeah. Okay, that's probably right. Yeah. Well, it's been great. It's been really good to have you over again, and you're very generous with your time, and you're genuinely a champion for all of the good things in this country, and a great friend and supporter of ours. So thank you for your time and giving up your Thursday and Friday to come and talk to South Australians about the world of politics.
Thank you, Alex, and keep up your own good work.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, mate.